Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of the Missouri Ozarks. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time at which you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing to which places and at what moments of the day or night these documented accounts reach. In the dense, remote hollows of the Missouri Ozarks, where the hills rise like ancient sentinels and valleys hide secrets beneath layers of mist and memory, there exists a case that local historians have called the cold case of the Eldridge brothers. The year was 1873, a time when America was still healing from the wounds of the Civil War, and when the isolated communities of the Ozarks operated by their own unwritten rules. Shannon County, Missouri, with its limestone caves and thick forests, was known primarily for its isolation and the fierce independence of its inhabitants. The small settlement of eminence, barely more than a collection of wooden structures clustered near the current river, served as the county seat, though law was often whatever the strongest family in the area decided it would be. It was in October of 1873 when a St. Louis journalist named Thomas Whitley first documented what would become known as the Eldridge brothers case. According to county records examined by Whitley, two brothers, Isaiah and Jeremiah Eldridge, had established a homestead some 7 miles northeast of Eminence in a remote hollow accessible only by a winding dirt trail that became nearly impassable during the frequent rains. The Eldridge property consisted of approximately 40 acres of rugged, mostly forested land, with a small clearing, where they had built a 2-room cabin and several outbuildings. What drew Whitley's attention wasn't the property itself, but rather the circumstances surrounding its abandonment and the subsequent discovery, made by a local trapper in the autumn of 1873. According to Whitley's notes, preserved in the Missouri Historical Society archives until their transfer to microfilm in 1961, the Eldridge brothers had arrived in Shannon County sometime in 1869, claiming to be veterans of the Confederate Army seeking a quiet place to establish a new life. The brothers kept to themselves, rarely venturing into Eminence except to sell moonshine, and occasionally purchase supplies they couldn't produce themselves. Jeremiah, the elder brother at approximately 35 years of age, was described in county records as a tall, gaunt man with a peculiar intensity to his gaze that made folks uneasy. Isaiah, younger by about 3 years, was reportedly more sociable, though still reserved by local standards. The brothers' background prior to their arrival in Shannon County remained largely undocumented, though rumors suggested they had fled from somewhere in Kentucky following some unspecified trouble. What's particularly notable about the case is that between 1869 and 1873, at least 7 travelers reportedly disappeared while passing through the vicinity of the Eldridge property. The disappearances, however, went largely uninvestigated. Shannon County had no formal sheriff during this period, and the isolated nature of the region meant that travelers frequently passed through without anyone taking particular notice of their coming or going. In September of 1873, a local trapper named Silas McCready was pursuing a wounded deer when he stumbled upon the Eldridge property. Finding the cabin apparently abandoned, McCready investigated further and made a discovery that would ultimately lead to the case being documented. According to his sworn statement recorded by a circuit judge who visited the county the following month, McCready found a peculiar arrangement of stones behind the main outbuilding, partially concealed by recently disturbed soil. What he uncovered beneath those stones was described in the official record only as evidence of wrongdoing sufficient to warrant further investigation. This deliberate vagueness in the official documentation has been a subject of historical debate. Whitley's personal notes, however, were more explicit, describing items of personal effects belonging to persons not of the Eldridge household, arranged in a manner suggesting a ritual significance rather than mere storage. By the time authorities organized a proper search of the property, the Eldridge brothers had vanished. Their disappearance created a void that would soon be filled with speculation, rumor, and gradually accumulating evidence of something far more disturbing than simple moonshining or even the occasional robbery of travelers. The investigation, such as it was in 1873 rural Missouri, uncovered several peculiarities about the brothers and their isolated homestead. First was the discovery of what appeared to be a detailed ledger, found hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the main cabin. The ledger, written in a meticulous hand later attributed to Jeremiah Eldridge, contained entries dating back to 1866, 3 years before the brothers allegedly arrived in Shannon County. Each entry followed a similar pattern: a date, a description of an individual, typically a lone traveler or occasionally a pair, and a series of cryptic notations that included measurements, weights, and what appeared to be observations about quality and suitability. The final pages of the ledger contained what one investigator described as recipes, though the ingredients listed were largely unintelligible, identified only by initials or symbols. The second significant discovery came when investigators began a more thorough examination of the property. Behind the cabin, partially hidden by a stand of oak trees, they found a small smokehouse, a common enough structure in that era. What was uncommon, however, was the construction of the smokehouse floor. Unlike the packed earth or rough wooden planking typical of such structures, the Eldridge smokehouse featured a carefully constructed stone floor with unusual drainage channels leading to a covered pit some 6 feet deep. The third and perhaps most disturbing element of the case emerged from interviews with the few neighbors who had any interaction with the Eldridge brothers. A woman named Martha Calloway, whose farm lay about 3 miles from the Eldridge property, told investigators that on 2 occasions she had observed the brothers leading heavily laden mules toward Eminence well after midnight. When asked what the brothers might have been transporting, Calloway reportedly said only that, whatever it was, they took uncommon care with it, like it was precious to them, and they covered it complete with canvas and rope. A storekeeper in Eminence, Jacob Thornton, provided additional information that cast further suspicion on the brothers' activities. According to ledgers kept by Thornton, the Eldridges regularly purchased unusual quantities of salt, black pepper, and a substance he recorded as preserving powder, likely saltpeter, commonly used in meat preservation during that era. What made these purchases noteworthy was not just their volume, but their timing. The brothers made these purchases regardless of season, whereas most local residents would only engage in large-scale meat preservation during the cool autumn months. The investigation might have ended there with suspicious circumstances, but no concrete evidence of wrongdoing beyond perhaps the illegal production of moonshine, had it not been for the arrival of a man named Frederick Pearson in Eminence in November of 1873. Pearson identified himself as a detective from the Pinkerton agency in St. Louis, hired by the family of a missing businessman named Walter Hammond. According to Pearson's report, later published in part by the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, Hammond had been traveling through southern Missouri in August of that year, intending to evaluate timber prospects for a St. Louis lumber company. His last known location had been a small tavern in Van Buren, about 30 miles northeast of Eminence, where he had mentioned to the proprietor his intention to explore prospects in Shannon County. Pearson's investigation led him to the abandoned Eldridge property, where he conducted a far more thorough search than local authorities had managed. What he discovered in the root cellar beneath the main cabin caused him to immediately dispatch a rider to Eminence requesting additional investigators and proper tools for excavation. The Pinkerton detectives' findings were documented in a report that was classified and sealed by order of the circuit judge, ostensibly to prevent public panic. According to courthouse records, that report remained sealed until 1937, when a flood damaged portions of the Shannon County Courthouse, leading to the relocation of numerous historical documents. During this process, the Pearson report was apparently misfiled and subsequently discovered by a court clerk named Abigail Winters. Winters made a copy of the report before returning the original to the courthouse archives. Her copy eventually found its way to historian Gerald McKinney, who included portions of it in his 1952 book, Forgotten Crimes of the Ozarks. The book received little attention outside academic circles and went out of print after a single small run. In 1968, the remaining copies were recalled and purchased by an anonymous collector, making the text extremely rare today. According to the portions of the Pearson report quoted in McKinney's book, the detective found evidence suggesting that the Eldridge brothers had engaged in activities far more disturbing than moonshining or robbery. The root cellar contained specialized tools, including several custom-made knives with unusually shaped blades, a set of butcher's hooks modified for some unspecified purpose, and most tellingly, a collection of personal items, watches, rings, wallets, and other effects, apparently taken from multiple individuals. But what transformed the case from a presumed series of robberies and possible murders into something far more sinister was the discovery made when Pearson and his team expanded their search to the area surrounding the smokehouse. There, using information extracted from the ledger, they uncovered a series of methodical excavations extending in a rough semicircle around the structure. The content of these excavations was described in the report only as remains inconsistent with traditional burial practices and suggesting knowledge of preservation techniques not common to the region. The most disturbing aspect of the Pearson report, however, was not what was found at the Eldridge property, but rather what was discovered when investigators began tracking the brothers' movements and connections. Through interviews with merchants in Springfield, Missouri, Pearson established that the Eldridges had been regularly transporting goods to that city, approximately 100 miles northwest of their Shannon County property. A butcher named William Gresham told investigators that he had purchased what he believed to be venison and wild boar from the brothers on at least 6 occasions between 1870 and 1873. Gresham described the meat as exceptional in quality, though sometimes unusual in its cutting. He had paid premium prices for the products, which he then sold to several of Springfield's more exclusive restaurants and hotels. The investigation took a darker turn when Pearson tracked down financial records indicating that the Eldridge brothers had opened an account at the Merchants Bank of Springfield in 1870 with an initial deposit of $233, a substantial sum for ostensibly poor homesteaders. By 1873, their account held over $3,000, with regular deposits following their trips to Springfield. What happened to the Eldridge brothers remains one of the enduring mysteries of the case. Despite an extensive manhunt throughout southern Missouri and into Arkansas, no confirmed sightings of either man were ever documented after their disappearance from Shannon County in September 1873. Rumors persisted for years, some claiming the brothers had fled to Texas, others suggesting they had been killed by relatives of their victims, and still others proposing they had simply established a new operation in another isolated region. In 1887, a man matching Jeremiah Eldridge's description was reported to be operating a small meat market in Shreveport, Louisiana, but by the time authorities investigated, the shop had been abandoned. Similarly, in 1891, a homesteader in the Colorado Territory who identified himself as Isaiah Smith was suspected by neighbors of being the younger Eldridge brother, but no formal investigation was ever conducted. The case might have faded entirely from public memory had it not been for a discovery made in 1952 during the construction of a new county road near the former Eldridge property. Workers excavating an area approximately half a mile from the original cabin site uncovered what was initially believed to be a Native American burial. Upon closer examination, however, archaeologists determined that the site contained the remains of at least 3 individuals buried sometime in the 1870s. According to the archaeological report filed with the University of Missouri in 1953, the bones showed evidence of skilled butchery consistent with professional meat processing techniques. More disturbingly, the report noted that Certain bones typically left intact in conventional burial were absent, while others showed signs of having been subjected to smoking or curing processes, similar to those used in meat preservation. The archaeological findings revived interest in the hot Eldridge case among historians and criminologists. What made the discovery particularly relevant to the Eldridge case was the condition of the remains. In 1955, criminologist Dr. Lawrence Holbrook of Washington University in St. Louis published a paper suggesting that the Eldridge brothers might represent one of the earliest documented cases of serial killers operating with a profit motive, rather than purely psychological compulsions. According to Holbrook's analysis, the brothers had developed a system whereby they identified and targeted travelers passing through the remote region, murdered them for their valuables, and then, in a macabre innovation, processed and sold portions of the victims' remains as exotic game meat to unsuspecting urban customers. This theory, while disturbing, would explain the brothers' unexplained wealth, their regular purchases of preservation materials, and the specialized tools found at their property. Holbrook's paper attracted considerable academic attention, but was largely dismissed by local Shannon County historians, who considered it sensationalistic and damaging to the region's reputation. Following several heated exchanges in academic journals, Holbrook abandoned his research on the case. His papers and notes were donated to Washington University's archives upon his death in 1967, but were reportedly lost during a cataloging error in 1968. In 1962, a journalist named Martin Crichton attempted to revive interest in the case through a series of articles for the Kansas City Star. Crichton traveled to Shannon County and spent several weeks interviewing elderly residents who claimed to have family connections to people involved in the original investigation. Most of these accounts were secondhand at best, but one interview stood out for its unusual detail and credibility. Crichton located 91-year-old Emmett McCready, the son of Silas McCready, the trapper who had first discovered the abandoned Eldridge property. According to the younger McCready, his father had shared details of the case that never appeared in official reports. Most notably, Silas had allegedly told his son that what he found beneath the stones behind the outbuilding was not merely personal effects, but rather glass jars containing preserved human tissue, arranged as if on display. Furthermore, Emmett claimed that his father had discovered a hidden compartment in the cabin containing what appeared to be a journal written by Jeremiah Eldridge. Unlike the ledger found by investigators, which primarily contained transaction-like entries, this journal allegedly contained the elder Eldridge's personal reflections on his activities. According to Emmett, his father had been so disturbed by the contents that he burned the journal rather than turning it over to authorities. While Crichton found Emmett McCready's account compelling, he was unable to corroborate it with any contemporary evidence. His series of articles attracted little attention outside Missouri, and the Kansas City Star discontinued it after just 3 installments, citing public disinterest. The most recent significant development in the Eldridge case came in 1968, when construction workers renovating the old Shannon County Courthouse discovered a sealed metal box hidden within a wall cavity. The box, apparently placed there sometime in the 1870s, contained several items related to the investigation, including daguerreotypes of the Eldridge property, a partial transcription of Jeremiah's ledger, and, most significantly, a sealed glass vial containing what appeared to be preserved tissue samples taken from the smokehouse site. County officials, uncertain how to proceed with such a discovery, reportedly contacted the FBI for assistance. According to courthouse records, 2 federal agents arrived within days to take possession of the box and its contents. No further information regarding their analysis or conclusions has ever been made public, and attempts by historians to access any related FBI files through Freedom of Information Act requests have been unsuccessful. What makes the Eldridge case particularly unsettling is not merely the brothers' apparent crimes, but the methodical, almost clinical nature of their operation. Unlike many murderers of the era, whose crimes were typically impulsive acts of passion or desperation, The evidence suggests that the Eldridges approached their activities with a calculated precision more reminiscent of modern serial killers. The ledger entries, with their careful measurements and evaluations, indicate a level of detachment and planning that criminologists find especially disturbing. Dr. Eleanor Mayhew, a forensic psychologist who reviewed the available evidence in 1964, noted in an unpublished monograph that the brothers appeared to have developed a systematic approach to selecting victims based on specific criteria, primarily targeting solitary male travelers of substantial build who would not be immediately missed. The remarkable aspect of the Eldridge case, Mayhew wrote, is not that such crimes occurred in a remote region during a lawless period, but rather the evident sophistication of the perpetrators in terms of victim selection, evidence concealment, and the creation of a profitable secondary enterprise from their primary criminal activity. This secondary enterprise, the apparent processing and sale of human remains as game meat, represents one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. William Gresham, the Springfield butcher who purchased meat from the brothers, later testified that the Eldridges had marketed their products as special venison and heritage boar, claiming the distinctive flavor came from the animal's diet of particular Ozark herbs and roots. Gresham's testimony, recorded during an interview with Pinkerton Detective Pearson in December 1873, included the disturbing observation that the meat supplied by the Eldridges commanded the highest prices from his wealthiest customers. Folks would ask special for it, Gresham stated, said it had a flavor unlike any game they'd had before. Some claimed it gave them unusual vigor, like a tonic medicine. This belief in the medicinal or invigorating properties of the meat sold by the Eldridges adds another layer of macabre fascination to the case. According to Pearson's notes, at least 3 prominent Springfield citizens, a banker, a judge, and a physician, had standing orders for the brothers' products, considering them a delicacy reserved for special occasions and important guests. The investigation into the Eldridge case was complicated by the social standing of those who had unwittingly consumed the brothers' products. When Pearson began connecting the brothers to Springfield's elite through their meat sales, he reportedly faced increasing pressure to handle the matter discreetly. According to a letter written by Pearson to his Pinkerton supervisor in St. Louis, dated January 17, 1874, he was approached by representatives of several influential Springfield families who urged him to consider the broader implications of his investigation. These gentlemen expressed concern, Pearson wrote, not for the Eldridge brothers, whom they readily condemned, but rather for the reputations of those who had innocently partaken of what might prove to be tainted goods. They feared that public revelation of the full circumstances would bring ruin upon respectable households and undermine civic confidence in the region's commercial establishments. Whether due to this pressure, or simply the challenges of investigating decades-old crimes in a remote region, many aspects of the Eldridge case remain unresolved. The total number of victims, for instance, has never been conclusively established. Pearson's report identified 7 individuals who had disappeared in the vicinity of the Eldridge property between 1869 and 1873, but the ledger discovered in the cabin contained entries suggesting a much higher count, possibly extending back to the brothers' time in Kentucky before their arrival in Missouri. The most comprehensive analysis of the case was conducted in 1967 by a University of Missouri graduate student named Rebecca Thornhill, whose master's thesis in criminology attempted to reconcile the various historical accounts and evidence. Thornhill's research, which included interviews with descendants of Shannon County residents from the 1870s and a review of previously unpublished court documents, proposed that the Eldridge brothers may have been responsible for as many as 21 disappearances over a 7-year period. Thornhill's thesis also explored a particularly disturbing aspect of the case that had received little previous attention: the possibility that the Eldridges had not worked alone. Through analysis of local records and contemporary accounts, she identified at least 3 occasions when the brothers had been seen in eminence, while simultaneously smoke had been observed rising from the chimney of their cabin miles away in the hollow. This observation led Thornhill to propose that the brothers might have had an accomplice, possibly a family member or associate who had never been identified. She noted several references in local accounts to a simple-minded cousin who occasionally visited the Eldridges, though no official record of such an individual exists in county documents. Thornhill's suggestion of a third participant in the Eldridge operation gained additional credibility in 1968 when the sealed box discovered in the Shannon County Courthouse was found to contain a daguerreotype showing the Eldridge cabin. In the background of the image, partially obscured by shadow, a third figure can be seen standing near the smokehouse. The quality of the image makes positive identification impossible, but the figure appears different in build and posture from either of the Eldridge brothers documented in other photographs. The question of what became of this potential third participant adds yet another layer of mystery to the already complex case. If such an individual existed, did they flee with the brothers when the homestead was abandoned in 1873? Or might they have remained in the region, perhaps even integrating into local society while harboring knowledge of the brothers' activities? This possibility takes on particular significance in light of an incident that occurred in eminence in 1879, 6 years after the Eldridge brothers' disappearance. According to court records, a drifter named Thomas Leach was arrested after attempting to sell personal items belonging to a recently disappeared traveler. During questioning, Leach reportedly claimed that he had learned his trade from masters of the craft and made reference to the hollow where the smoke never stops. When investigators attempted to question Leach further about these statements, they found him dead in his cell, apparently having taken his own life by means of a concealed razor. The incident was briefly investigated, but ultimately dismissed as the desperate act of a common criminal seeking to create mystery around himself. In retrospect, however, Thornhill and other researchers have suggested that Leach's statements and subsequent death may represent a tangential connection to the Eldridge case that was overlooked by contemporary authorities. The potential geographic scope of the Eldridge brothers' activities presents another unresolved aspect of the case. While the focus of the original investigation centered on their Shannon County property, subsequent research has identified similar patterns of disappearances and unusual meat sales in other regions where individuals matching the brothers' descriptions were reported to have resided. In particular, records from Harlan County, Kentucky, indicate that between 1864 and 1869, immediately preceding the brothers' arrival in Missouri, at least 4 travelers disappeared while passing through a remote area locally known as Stillhouse Hollow. During this same period, a pair of brothers named Edward and John Smith operated a small smokehouse in the region, selling what they described as mountain-raised venison to merchants in the larger town of Harlan. The parallel with the Eldridge operation in Missouri is striking, though no contemporary connection was ever made between the Smith brothers of Kentucky and the Eldridges of Missouri. It was not until 1963, when historian Patricia Donovan was researching disappearances in the Appalachian region during the post-Civil War period, that the potential link was identified. Donovan discovered a record in the Harlan County Courthouse indicating that Edward and John Smith had abruptly departed the region in early 1869, following an incident described only as unwelcome scrutiny from outside parties. The timing aligns perfectly with the Eldridge brothers' arrival in Shannon County, Missouri, later that same year. Furthermore, a physical description of Edward Smith in the Harlan County records bears a remarkable resemblance to that of Jeremiah Eldridge in the Missouri documents. Both men are described as tall and gaunt, with a distinctive scar extending from the left ear to the corner of the mouth. This particular detail was not included in any published accounts of the Eldridge case and appears only in the original court documents, making the correlation especially compelling. If Edward and John Smith were indeed Jeremiah and Isaiah Eldridge operating under aliases, it would suggest a pattern of methodical operations spanning multiple states and potentially involving dozens of victims over nearly a decade. The brothers would establish themselves in a remote location, develop their operation over several years, and then relocate when local suspicion or outside investigation threatened to expose them. This pattern might also explain the brothers' ultimate fate following their disappearance from Shannon County in 1873. Rather than being captured or killed, they may simply have moved to yet another isolated region and resumed their activities under new identities. The reports of individuals resembling the brothers in Louisiana in 1887 and Colorado in 1891 could represent subsequent iterations of their operation, though neither was investigated thoroughly enough at the time to establish a definitive connection. One of the most disturbing possibilities raised by modern analysis of the Eldridge case is that the brothers may have been part of a larger network of like-minded individuals operating throughout the frontier regions of post-Civil War America. The years following the conflict were marked by significant population movement, limited law enforcement in remote areas, and a general atmosphere of societal disruption that could have provided cover for organized criminal activities. Dr. Holbrook, in his 1955 analysis, briefly considered this possibility, noting that the sophistication of the Eldridge operation, particularly their ability to market and distribute their products through legitimate commercial channels, suggested a level of organization that might extend beyond two isolated individuals. However, he ultimately concluded that the evidence was insufficient to support such a theory. The potential existence of a broader network takes on new significance in light of a discovery made in 1966 during the renovation of a historic hotel in Springfield, Missouri. Workers removing a section of wall in what had once been the hotel's kitchen uncovered a small tin box containing a single sheet of paper. The document, written in a cramped, precise hand, listed 12 sets of initials, each followed by a location designated only by a letter and number combination. Among the entries was JE and IE, or SC, which some researchers have interpreted as referring to Jeremiah and Isaiah Eldridge in Shannon County. If this interpretation is correct, the document might represent a record of individuals engaged in similar activities throughout the region, with the letter number combinations indicating specific territories or operational areas. The document was turned over to local authorities who, finding no evidence of recent criminal activity, eventually transferred it to the Missouri Historical Society. There it remained largely forgotten until 1969, when researcher Martin Creighton came across it while investigating another matter. Creighton immediately recognized the potential connection to the Eldridge case and attempted to analyze the other initials and location codes on the list. His efforts yielded limited results, though he did identify two other sets of initials that potentially corresponded to unsolved disappearances in Missouri and Arkansas during the same period. Before he could complete his analysis, however, Creighton suffered a severe stroke that left him unable to continue his work. His notes on the subject were reportedly among the materials donated to the University of Missouri Archives upon his death in 1972, but they have never been conclusively located. The discovery of the list raises disturbing questions about the scope and organization of potential criminal networks in the post-Civil War frontier. If the Eldridge brothers were indeed part of a larger association of individuals engaged in similar activities, the implications for historical understanding of crime in the period would be significant. Most researchers who have studied the case, however, maintain that the evidence more strongly supports the theory that the Eldridges operated independently, developing their particular methodology through trial and error, rather than as part of an organized network. The unique aspects of their operation, particularly the processing and sale of human remains as exotic meat, have few documented parallels in criminal history, suggesting an innovative approach rather than an established practice. The psychological profile of the Eldridge brothers represents another area of ongoing fascination and debate among researchers. Unlike many criminals of their era who left behind letters, confessions, or other direct expressions of their motivations, the brothers maintained an almost complete documentary silence regarding the purpose or justification for their activities. The ledger found in their cabin, with its clinical notations and measurements, offers perhaps the only direct insight into their thinking. The methodical nature of these entries, with their focus on physical characteristics and quality assessments, suggests individuals who viewed their victims primarily as resources rather than as human beings, a perspective that criminologists identify as extreme objectification, common among the most dangerous type of serial offenders. Dr. Mayhew, in her 1964 analysis, proposed that this objectification might have its roots in the brothers' experiences during the Civil War. If they did indeed serve in the Confederate Army, as they claimed upon their arrival in Shannon County, they would have been exposed to the mass casualties and dehumanization inherent in that conflict. For individuals with certain pre-existing psychological tendencies, such exposure could potentially normalize violence and diminish the perceived value of human life. This theory gained additional support in 1965 when a military historian named Robert Canfield discovered records indicating that two brothers named Eldridge had served in the 5th Kentucky Infantry Regiment, Confederate, during the war. The regiment had participated in several of the conflict's bloodiest engagements, including the Battle of Shiloh, where casualties were particularly severe. More significantly, the regiment's records indicate that during the winter of 1863-1864, when supplies were critically low, several soldiers were court-martialed for robbing the dead and, in at least one case, for the unlawful consumption of flesh not proper for human sustenance. While the records do not specifically name the Eldridge brothers in connection with these incidents, their presence in the regiment during this period suggests possible exposure to extreme survival situations that might have influenced their subsequent behavior. The potential connection to wartime experiences offers one of the few plausible explanations for the brothers' evolution from apparent conventional soldiers to methodical killers and processors of human remains. The transition from the battlefield, where killing is sanctioned and dead bodies are commonplace, to civilian life can be challenging even for psychologically healthy individuals. For those with predispositions toward violence or sociopathy, the contrast between wartime and peacetime norms might create a context in which deviant behaviors could develop and escalate. This theory is supported by the apparent timeline of the brothers' activities. If the connection to Edward and John Smith of Harlan County, Kentucky is valid, then their criminal operations began shortly after the conclusion of the Civil War, a period when they would have been transitioning from military to civilian life, while also dealing with the broader societal disruption of the post-war South. The progression from their early activities in Kentucky to the more sophisticated operation in Missouri would then represent an evolution of both methodology and scale. What might have begun as opportunistic predation on vulnerable travelers could have developed into the systematic operation documented in Shannon County, with its specialized tools, record-keeping, and commercial distribution network. This developmental pattern aligns with modern understanding of serial offenders, who typically refine their methods through experience and repetition. The brothers' apparent success in evading detection over a period of years would have reinforced their behaviors while allowing them to perfect their techniques, both for killing and processing victims and for concealing evidence of their activities. The most disturbing aspect of the Eldridge case from a psychological perspective is the apparent absence of the emotional or sexual motivations typically associated with serial killers. Unlike most such offenders who derive psychological or physical gratification from the act of killing itself, the evidence suggests that the Eldridges viewed murder primarily as a means to a financial end, a perspective that criminologists find particularly troubling for its cold rationality. This profit motive, combined with the methodical record-keeping documented in the ledger, places the brothers in a rare category of offender that bridges the gap between serial killers and organized crime. Their operation, with its focus on resource extraction, both valuables and remains, from victims and subsequent monetization through legitimate commercial channels, represents a disturbing hybrid of predatory violence and entrepreneurial calculation. The long-term impact of the Eldridge case on the communities where they operated extends far beyond the immediate investigation and its inconclusive results. In Shannon County, the legacy of the brothers' activities manifested in a pervasive wariness toward outsiders that persisted for generations, a wariness documented by numerous researchers who encountered significant resistance when attempting to investigate the case. Martin Creighton, in his notes from his 1962 visit to the region, described the reaction of local residents when he inquired about the Eldridge brothers. It's as if a curtain comes down. People who moments before were speaking freely about local history suddenly find urgent business elsewhere. Those who do respond offer only the most minimal acknowledgement that the brothers existed, usually followed by assurances that whatever happened was long ago and best forgotten. This collective reticence suggests a community response to trauma, a shared decision to distance themselves from events too disturbing to incorporate into their communal identity. Similar patterns have been observed in other locations associated with notorious crimes, where residents often develop protective narratives that minimize or externalize the horror that occurred in their midst. In Springfield, Missouri, where unwitting consumers had purchased and consumed the brothers' products, the response took a different form. Rather than collective silence, the community experienced what one contemporary observer described as a season of digestive hysteria when the nature of the Eldridge brothers' business became known in early 1874. According to reports in the Springfield Republican newspaper, local physicians were overwhelmed with patients reporting mysterious ailments that they attributed to having consumed meat purchased from establishments known to have dealt with the Eldridges. While most of these complaints likely represented psychosomatic responses to the disturbing revelation, the episode illustrates the profound psychological impact of the case on those who feared they had been unwittingly drawn into the brothers' macabre commerce. The enduring fascination with the Eldridge case among researchers, despite the fragmentary nature of the evidence and the passage of nearly 150 years, speaks to its unique position at the intersection of multiple categories of historical interest: criminal history, post-Civil War social dynamics, frontier justice, or its absence, and the dark potential of human psychology when unrestrained by social constraints or effective law enforcement. Unlike many historical crimes that have faded from collective memory, the Eldridge case continues to generate new analyses and interpretations with each passing decade. Its persistence in scholarly discourse may reflect the fundamental, unresolved nature of the case. The absence of definitive answers regarding the brothers' fate, the total extent of their crimes, or the full truth of their operation leaves space for continued investigation and speculation. This quality of irresolution resonates with a broader theme in American frontier history: the tension between the documented and the unknowable. Just as the wilderness that once covered the continent has been largely tamed and charted, the dark corners of human behavior represented by cases like that of the Eldridge brothers resist complete illumination, remaining shadowy territories on the map of our understanding. Today, the physical location of the Eldridge brothers' Shannon County homestead lies within the boundaries of the Mark Twain National Forest, accessible only by a seldom-used hiking trail that doesn't appear on most maps. The cabin and outbuildings have long since returned to the earth, leaving only subtle depressions in the forest floor to mark where they once stood. Local residents still occasionally report unusual experiences in the vicinity, a persistent silence, as if the forest itself holds its breath, or the faint scent of smoke when no fire is burning. These reports, while impossible to verify objectively, contribute to the area's reputation as a place best avoided, especially after dark. In 1975, a group of archaeology students from the University of Missouri attempted to conduct a systematic survey of the site as part of a broader study of 19th-century homesteads in the Ozarks. According to their field notes, the project was abandoned after 3 days due to equipment failures and adverse conditions. One participant, speaking anonymously to a student newspaper upon returning to campus, described experiencing an overwhelming sense of being watched throughout their time at the site. Whether such accounts represent genuine paranormal phenomena, the power of suggestion acting on individuals aware of the site's history, or simply the natural unease that can arise in remote locations, they contribute to the enduring mystique surrounding the Eldridge case. The hollow where the brothers once lived has become a place where history and folklore intersect, where the documented horrors of the past blend seamlessly with the more nebulous fears of the present. In 1982, a more thorough archaeological investigation was organized by Dr. Howard Mitchell of the Missouri State Archaeological Survey. With proper equipment and a team of experienced researchers, Mitchell hoped to resolve some of the lingering questions about the physical evidence at the site. Over the course of 2 weeks, the team conducted a methodical survey of approximately 5 acres surrounding the presumed location of the cabin. Their findings, detailed in a report published in the Journal of Historical Archaeology in 1983, included the stone foundation of the main cabin, portions of the unusual drainage system associated with the smokehouse, and most significantly, a series of small, regular depressions extending in an arc behind where the outbuildings would have stood, corresponding to the methodical excavations mentioned in the Pearson Report from 1873. Excavation of several of these depressions yielded bone fragments that Mitchell's team initially identified as animal remains. However, subsequent laboratory analysis by forensic anthropologist Dr. Eleanor Wilkins revealed that at least some of the fragments were human in origin. More disturbing was Wilkins's observation that many of the bones showed clear evidence of butchery with fine-edged tools, including saw marks consistent with careful sectioning rather than violent dismemberment. Carbon dating of the remains placed them between 1865 and 1875, aligning perfectly with the period of the Eldridge brothers' occupation of the site. The discovery provided the first scientifically verified physical evidence connecting the brothers to the processing of human remains, confirming a central element of the historical accounts that some researchers had previously questioned. Mitchell's team also recovered several small personal items from the site, including buttons, a pocket watch case, and a gold wedding band inscribed with the initials MLH to WH, 1868, potentially connecting to Walter Hammond, the missing businessman whose disappearance had initially brought Pinkerton detective Frederick Pearson to Shannon County in 1873. These findings, while significant, still left many aspects of the case unresolved. The total number of victims, the full extent of the brothers' operation, and their ultimate fate remained matters of conjecture rather than established fact. Mitchell concluded his report with the observation that the archaeological record, while confirming the disturbing reality at the core of the Eldridge case, can only hint at the full scope of their activities. The personal backgrounds of the Eldridge brothers themselves represent another area where fact and speculation have often blended. The claim that they were Confederate veterans appears to be substantiated by the military records discovered by historian Robert Canfield, but their lives before and after the war remain largely obscure. In 1984, genealogist Margaret Holloway attempted to trace the brothers' family connections through census records and other public documents. Her research, published in the Journal of American Genealogy, identified a Jeremiah and Isaiah Eldridge born to a tenant farming family in eastern Tennessee in 1838 and 1841, respectively, ages that would align with the descriptions of the Shannon County brothers. According to Holloway's findings, the Eldridge family relocated to Harlan County, Kentucky in the early 1850s, where the father worked as a butcher's assistant before his death in 1858. This detail takes on particular significance in light of the brothers' later activities, suggesting that they may have acquired their knowledge of meat processing through family occupation rather than through independent experimentation. Holloway's research also uncovered a significant gap in the documented history of the Eldridge brothers between their presumed enlistment in the Confederate Army in 1861 and their appearance in Harlan County as Edward and John Smith in 1864. This period, coinciding with the most intense years of the Civil War, might have been formative in the development of their particular pathology. Military historian James Donovan, building on Holloway's work, proposed in a 1986 article that the brothers might have served not only in conventional combat roles, but potentially in irregular units engaged in behind-the-lines operations. Such units, operating with limited supervision and engaged in activities including sabotage, assassination, and terror tactics against civilian populations, existed on both sides of the conflict. Donovan noted that the 5th Kentucky Infantry, where soldiers named Eldridge were documented, was temporarily attached to a command that included several such irregular units during the winter of 1863-1864. While no direct evidence places the brothers in these units, Donovan suggested that exposure to their methods might have influenced the brothers' subsequent approach to violence, particularly the emphasis on secrecy, efficiency, and the disposal of evidence. This military connection, if accurate, would place the Eldridge brothers in a category of killers whose violent tendencies were shaped or activated by wartime experiences, a pattern observed in other historical cases where former soldiers have transitioned from sanctioned battlefield violence to criminal predation in civilian contexts. The commercial aspect of the Eldridge operation remains one of its most distinctive and disturbing features. Unlike most killers who dispose of remains to conceal evidence, the brothers apparently developed a system for processing and profiting from their victims' bodies, an innovation that criminologists find particularly significant. Forensic psychologist Dr. Rachel Simmons, in a 2011 analysis published in the Journal of Criminal Psychology, characterized this aspect of the case as representing an unusually complete merger of homicidal and entrepreneurial impulses. According to Simmons, most profit-motivated killers focus primarily on stealing valuables, or in cases like kidnapping, extracting ransom, treating the victim's body as waste to be discarded. What distinguishes the Eldridge case, Simmons wrote, is the apparent totality of the resource extraction. The brothers seemingly viewed their victims as sources of multiple forms of value. First, the conventional portable wealth of travelers, money, watches, etc., and then the commercial value of the remains themselves. This comprehensive approach suggests a level of objectification and commodification of human life that exceeds even that typically seen in serial offenders. This commercial sophistication raises questions about how the brothers developed and refined their particular methodology. If they did indeed operate first in Kentucky as the Smith brothers and then in Missouri as the Eldridges, the evolution of their techniques over time would represent a disturbing learning curve, one that potentially continued after their disappearance from Shannon County in 1873. The reports of individuals resembling the brothers in Louisiana in 1887 and Colorado in 1891 take on additional significance when considered in this light. If these sightings did indeed represent the Eldridges continuing their activities in new locations, they would have had nearly 2 decades to perfect their methods since their first documented operations in Kentucky. The implications of such long-term, multi-state criminal activity operating beneath the notice of authorities are profoundly troubling. The Eldridge case also raises questions about potential victims who may never have been identified or connected to the brothers' activities. The 7 disappearances documented in Shannon County between 1869 and 1873 likely represent only a fraction of the total if the brothers operated for years across multiple states. Historian Eliza Montgomery, in a 1992 study of unsolved disappearances in the post-Civil War frontier, identified 34 cases between 1865 and 1895 that shared characteristics potentially connecting them to the Eldridge pattern. Lone male travelers, often carrying significant sums of money, who vanished while passing through remote areas where individuals matching the brothers' descriptions had been reported. While acknowledging that many of these disappearances might have other explanations, from natural disasters to unrelated criminal activity, Montgomery argued that at least some likely represented undocumented victims of the Eldridges, or potentially of others, employing similar methods. Her study highlighted the limitations of historical criminal investigation in an era before standardized record-keeping, forensic science, or effective communication between jurisdictions. The question of whether others might have adopted the Eldridge brothers' particular methodology represents another disturbing possibility. The case received limited public attention at the time, with most newspaper accounts focusing on the disappearances and robbery aspects rather than the processing and sale of remains. However, those directly involved in the investigation would have been aware of the full details, creating the potential for imitation. Thomas Leach, the drifter arrested in Eminence in 1879, who claimed to have learned his trade from masters of the craft, represents one potential example of such imitation. His apparent suicide before detailed questioning prevented investigators from determining whether his statement referred specifically to the Eldridge brothers or whether he had actual knowledge of their methods. More broadly, the remote regions of the Ozarks and Appalachia, with their isolated hollows and limited law enforcement, continued to experience occasional disappearances well into the 20th century. While most such cases likely had conventional explanations, the Eldridge case suggests the possibility that similar operations might have existed, perhaps on a smaller scale, in other locations. The cultural impact of the Eldridge case, while limited by its relative obscurity in mainstream historical accounts, has nonetheless been significant within certain contexts. In the Missouri Ozarks, particularly in Shannon County, the story has assumed the status of a dark legend, a cautionary tale about the dangers that might lurk in seemingly peaceful rural settings. Local folklore researcher Dr. Samuel Hawkins documented several variations of the Eldridge story that circulated orally in the region throughout the 20th century. In a 1997 article for the Journal of American Folklore, Hawkins noted that these versions often incorporated supernatural elements absent from the historical record, describing the brothers as possessing unnatural strength or the ability to lure travelers through hypnotic suggestion. These folkloric adaptations, Hawkins wrote, transform the historical Eldridges from human criminals, however monstrous, into something more akin to demons or evil spirits, entities that represent a fundamental malevolence in the landscape rather than mere human depravity. This transformation from historical figures to folkloric entities reflects a common pattern in the cultural processing of traumatic events. By recasting the brothers as supernatural rather than human, the community creates psychological distance from the disturbing reality that ordinary men committed such acts in their midst. The Eldridge case has also periodically attracted attention from true crime authors and documentary filmmakers, though often with significant embellishment or sensationalization. A 1976 paperback titled Butchers of the Ozarks presented a heavily fictionalized account that inserted romantic subplots and graphic violence absent from the historical record. Similarly, a 1988 low-budget documentary called American Monsters, The Eldridge Brothers, included dramatic reenactments that emphasized the more lurid aspects of the case while neglecting its historical context. More scholarly treatment came in 2003, when historian Richard Patterson included a chapter on the Eldridge case in his book Forgotten Horrors: Criminal Episodes in American History. Patterson's account, based on extensive archival research, placed the brothers' activities within the broader context of post-Civil War social disruption and the limited law enforcement capabilities of frontier regions. The Eldridge case, Patterson wrote, represents not an aberration but rather an extreme manifestation of conditions that existed throughout much of the American frontier during this period. The isolation that attracted settlers seeking independence also created spaces where predators could operate with minimal risk of detection or intervention. This contextual approach to understanding the Eldridge case aligns with modern criminological perspectives that emphasize the role of opportunity and absence of guardianship in facilitating criminal behavior. The brothers did not operate in a vacuum, but rather exploited specific vulnerabilities in the social and legal structures of their time and place. The legal legacy of the Eldridge case, while difficult to trace directly, potentially includes its influence on the development of more coordinated approaches to investigating disappearances across jurisdictional boundaries. The difficulties encountered by authorities attempting to track the brothers across state lines highlighted the limitations of localized law enforcement in addressing mobile criminal operations. In 1874, partly in response to the Eldridge case and similar situations, the governors of Missouri, Arkansas, and Kentucky established a formal agreement for the sharing of information regarding missing persons and suspected criminals operating across state boundaries. While primitive by modern standards, this arrangement represented an early step toward the regional and national law enforcement coordination that would develop more fully in the 20th century. The medical implications of the Eldridge brothers' activities have also attracted scholarly attention, particularly regarding the potential consequences for those who unknowingly consumed the meat sold by the brothers. Dr. Harold Winstead's observation of a cluster of neurological conditions among Springfield's elite in the 1890s, potentially connected to the consumption of contaminated meat decades earlier, raises disturbing possibilities about the long-term public health impact of the brothers' commerce. Modern medical researchers have noted that certain prion diseases, fatal brain disorders caused by misfolded proteins, can have incubation periods of many years or even decades. Melissa Carpenter, a neurologist who reviewed Winstead's accounts in a 2005 article for the Journal of Historical Medicine, concluded that while definitive diagnosis is impossible based on the limited historical descriptions, the pattern of symptoms described is consistent with what we now recognize as variant Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, which can be transmitted through the consumption of contaminated neural tissue. This medical dimension adds yet another layer of horror to the Eldridge case, the possibility that the brothers' crimes continued to claim victims years or even decades after their disappearance, as those who had unknowingly consumed their products succumbed to slow-developing neurological conditions. If the brothers' customers did indeed consume human tissue, they might have been exposed to such diseases, potentially explaining the symptoms described by Winstead. Doctor. As the hills and hollows of the Ozarks continue to change with time, the story of the Eldridge brothers serves as a dark reminder of the secrets that remote places can hold, of the thin veneer of civilization that sometimes masks unthinkable horrors, and of how easily the truth can be lost to history when those who know it choose silence over the discomfort of acknowledgement. For those inclined to visit Shannon County today, locals still occasionally reference the Eldridge Hollow, though few could direct you to its precise location. Perhaps that's for the best. Some places, marked by darkness, are better left undisturbed, and some stories, no matter how compelling our need to know their endings, are perhaps better left unfinished. As one elderly Shannon County resident told Martin Creighton in 1962, there are two kinds of silence in these hills, the natural quiet that brings peace and the heavy silence that falls when something best forgotten tries to be remembered. When you're in the woods around here, you learn to tell the difference. The final, perhaps most unsettling aspect of the Eldridge case is the possibility that the brothers, or individuals employing their methods might have continued operating well into the 20th century. The remote regions of the American interior, with their decreasing but still significant areas of isolation, could have provided cover for similar operations long after the original Eldridge brothers had passed from the scene. In 1956, a hunter in rural Oregon discovered an abandoned cabin containing equipment similar to that described in the Eldridge case: specialized cutting tools, a modified smokehouse, and a ledger containing entries with measurements and quality notations. Local authorities, unfamiliar with the historical Missouri case, investigated the site as a potential poaching operation. By the time historian Gerald McKinney made the connection to the Eldridge pattern in 1963, the trail had gone cold. Similarly, in 1964, a hiker in the Bitterroot Mountains of Idaho reported finding a remote camp containing preserved human remains that had been processed in a manner consistent with professional butchery. By the time authorities reached the location, the site had been cleared, with only a few scattered tools remaining as evidence that anyone had been there at all. These incidents, while impossible to connect definitively to the Eldridge legacy, suggest the disturbing possibility that their methodology might have been adopted and adapted by others, either through direct transmission of knowledge or through independent development of similar techniques. The isolated nature of such operations would make detection unlikely, particularly if the practitioners maintained the brothers' apparent discipline regarding victim selection and evidence disposal. Today, with improved forensic techniques, DNA analysis, and coordinated law enforcement databases, such operations would face greater challenges in avoiding detection. Yet remote areas still exist where determined individuals might operate outside effective oversight, and the disappearance of hikers, transients, and other vulnerable individuals continues to occur at rates that exceed clear resolutions. The Eldridge brothers, whether they died soon after their disappearance from Shannon County or continued their activities for decades in other locations, represent a disturbing chapter in American criminal history, one that challenges comfortable assumptions about the limits of human behavior and the safety of even the most seemingly peaceful rural settings. Their legacy lives on not only in the academic studies and folklore of the Ozarks, but in the subtle wariness that still characterizes the region's approach to strangers and the persistent rumors that circulate about certain remote hollows where locals refuse to venture after dark. As one Shannon County resident told a researcher in 2012, "Some places hold memories that the trees won't even whisper." In the end, perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Eldridge case is not what we know about the brothers and their activities, but what remains unknown, the questions that may never be fully answered about the extent of their crimes, the fate of all their victims, and whether their particular brand of methodical predation truly ended with their disappearance or merely transformed and continued in ways yet to be discovered. For in the shadowed hollows of America's rural landscape, where isolation provides both sanctuary and opportunity, the conditions that allowed the Eldridge brothers to operate have never entirely disappeared. And as long as travelers venture into remote regions, following winding dirt roads to destinations others cannot easily locate, the potential for similar predators remains, a dark possibility etched into the landscape itself, as permanent as the ancient hills of the Ozarks and as quietly persistent as the fog that rises from their valleys on cold autumn mornings.